Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming this evening. Welcome to my very cold house. It's freezing in here. I'm not quite sure what's happened to the heating. I think my wife has turned the thermostat down this evening. So tonight we have a talk about lambing nutrition, and especially around the ewes, this stage of pregnancy and just immediately post lambing, that crucial time for ewes to make sure lambs thrive. So remember, several weeks ago we talked about the importance of body condition scoring and getting ewes in the right condition, building up to lambing. This is the bit where all the magic now happens. So tonight's the person who's going to give us a fantastic talk tonight is named Alison Bond. You met Alison before. You met her several weeks ago. Alison works for Ramenco and has been there, I don't know how many years, probably several, maybe 10 or 12, I don't know.
Maybe nearer 20, John.
Nearer 20, been very, very successful, supports us on farm a lot. And if you want to talk to Alison direct, we can get her out onto farm, talk you through rations and nutrition, which we're trying to do more of anytime you want. So I'm not going to dwell too long. I'm going to pass straight over to Alison because it looks like we have quite a few people already on the meeting. So Alison, all over to you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. There we go. Get rid of that and put that one back up. There we go. Hopefully we are sharing and we are good to go. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this rather chilly evening. I don't suppose there's much else best on the telly, so yeah, settle for me. So the idea behind this evening really is just to go through a little bit of pre-lambing nutrition. As John said, moving then on to look at that post-lambing nutrition into lactation. We'll focus in particular on the energy and protein, and we'll look a little bit at some requirements. I'll try not to keep it I'll try and keep it a bit base level without getting too technical, but look at how we can perhaps calculate some of those requirements and what our diets are providing. We'll look at mins, vits and trace elements in brief, not forgetting that water and the importance of that water in the lambing shed. And then we'll dig a bit deeper into those grazing and forages, looking in particular at what we've seen this year and the management of that from a feeding point of view. And then finally, just balancing that diet. What else can we feed to top up on those forages and grazing that we've already got? So I'm happy to take questions throughout. Just throw them in the chat or the Q&A, and John can pick them up for me and interrupt me. So just making a start really with that pre-lambing nutrition. So we're talking really of that period from around day 90 to day 145. So the last sort of 5 to 6 weeks of the pregnancy. And during this period, there's quite a lot going on. We can see from this little graph we've got up in the top right hand corner that our lamb is doing an incredible amount of growth during this time. So 70% of that fetal growth will occur during that last 6 weeks of the pregnancy. So it weighs about 800 grams at 8 weeks pre-lambing, and will be somewhere around 4.5 kilos at birth. So you can see, there's a lot going on. And this puts quite a lot of stress on our ewe. It pulls large amounts of energy and protein to just put into that growth of that lamb. But there's a lot of other stuff going on as well as she prepares for lambing. So during this time, her udder is also developing, and she's laying down those milk cells ready for that colostrum production and that milk production. And we know that nutrition from that mid-pregnancy on into this late pregnancy period is absolutely crucial for driving that colostrum. And we know how important that colostrum is for those baby lambs as well. So, we're seeing a situation where energy and protein requirements are increasing quite rapidly. But at the same time, we're also seeing a drop in our ewe's appetite too, as that room inside of her becomes compromised. Her rumen will be squashed. And so that is so important that we increase that nutrient density of that diet. So anybody that's joined me before for any of my lambing presentations will have seen this picture, but it just demonstrates so nicely, I think, how squashed that rumen is becoming. So the picture you can see on the left-hand side is a barren ewe, and that rumen is that big black space that we can see there. If we move across to the right-hand side, we've got our twin-bearing ewe. She's about 100 days into gestation, so about 7 weeks pre-lambing. And you can see these are the lambs down in the bottom, and this black space here is her rumen, and you can see how that rumen is being squashed by her growing lambs. So whilst her nutritional requirements are increasing, her ability to eat is decreasing by the day. So real key message here is actually that intake is reducing whilst her demands are increasing for energy and protein. So can't emphasize enough the importance of that nutrient density of that diet. And again, nice diagram here demonstrating nicely the potential gap we may see in terms of negative energy balance as that ewe finds herself in later pregnancy. So our red line here shows our ewe's nutritional requirements, so you can see them increasing as we progress through that pregnancy, and then our blue line shows the physical capacity to consume feed, and again we can see that decreasing as that pregnancy progresses. So what that gives us is that green gap, I suppose, which is our gap in the nutrition, and it's that gap, not just energy and protein, but also in minerals, vitamins, trace elements that we're really trying to manage on that in feeding that ewe on the approach to lambing. And looking at that diet, we're trying to we're not going to be able to obviously minimize her energy requirements, but if we can maximize her dry matter intake by feeding in certain feeds and by feeding in a certain way, we can just squash that gap down and put her at less risk of metabolic issues. As we move then on into that post-lambing period, it doesn't stop there. And I think quite often we do underestimate actually the significance of that sheep lactation. It has a massive impact on our lamb performance. In that first sort of 6 weeks of life, our lambs will be relying almost entirely on that milk that mum's producing. And again, diet will play a big role in the kind of quality of that milk and quantity of that milk as well. So we're trying to ensure high milk yield. This helps us achieve our optimum 8-week weights. By this time, we're going to be talking early, mid-spring. We want to be getting maximum contribution from grass and forage, and really just topping that up if required. We want to manage health issues such as mastitis as well. We don't want to cause those issues for our ewe, which is going to then impact on milk, which is then going to impact on our lamb growth as well. And again, minimising that risk of things like milk fever and grass staggers as well. So if we can look at after her during lambing, we get her off to a good start in this lactation stage. And then if we can look after her for this lactation, we're going to get better growth from our lambs. But also we need to look longer term as well in terms of the ewe recovering from that pregnancy and getting ready for the next pregnancy as well. So it's a much bigger picture. In terms of lactation, our ewes will typically produce around 1.5 to 3 litres. So 3 litres at their peak. And if you do a sort of ratio to sort of a 75 kilo ewe and a 3 kilo milk production, that ratio is very similar to your high yielding dairy cow producing sort of 35, 40 litres, weighing sort of 700 kilos. So we really need to be looking after her as we would a high yielding dairy cow. Our peak milk production will be about 3 to 4 weeks post lambing, so it's not a huge long lactation, and therefore 75% of our total milk yield will be produced in that sort of 7 to 8 weeks, looking at kind of weaning around 12 weeks. And we know, like I say, that high milk yield will support that optimal lamb growth. It will help us hit our 8-week targets, which is a massive key performance indicator of our ewe performance on farm. So we do really need to be thinking about that sheep lactation. Our ewe with twins will produce about 30 to 50% more milk than our ewes with a single lamb. And this again is obviously going to affect nutrient demand. So we need to take into consideration how many lambs she's nursing, and a ewe's requirement during lactation will also be affected by age, body condition score, and the feeding regime that was undertaken during pregnancy and through into lactation. So if she's been allowed to drop body condition, for example, on the approach to lambing, then that's going to impact her milk going into that lactation as well. So immediately after lambing, our ewe's nutrient requirement will increase quite rapidly to support that milk production. So an 80 kilo ewe, for example, with twins will increase her energy and protein by about 60 and 44% respectively. So quite a big increase in those requirements. But unfortunately, that increase in nutrient demand is not often covered by grazing. And so some kind of supplementary feeding is going to be necessary, depending on the season, depending on how that grass comes in as well. We also don't see a massive increase in voluntary feed intake as well. It seems to be a little bit slow to catch up in that period after lambing. So we'll only see a 10% higher increase in dry matter intake at the start of lactation compared to late pregnancy. But like we said, we see this massive requirement for extra energy and protein. So again, we need to be taking that into consideration. And like I said, our ewe will also be starting to prepare for her next pregnancy. Around 6 weeks post lambing, she'll be starting to produce the eggs that will then go on to be fertilized later in the season. So if there's an energy deficit or a mineral and vitamin deficit, that can then impact on that pregnancy and that next season as well. Let's not forget our younger animals as well. So our shearlings that sort of are going on into their sort of second year, we want them to be mated at 80% of the mature weight. But that means they are still growing during that pregnancy period. So we need to take that into consideration. So when we're looking at pre-lambing diets for these youngsters, we're looking at maybe 10% more energy and protein than your mature animals. And also be aware of shy feeders. This might be the first, well, will be the first time for them being in the flock, and they can easily be bullied and knocked out. So it's always good, if possible, to separate out perhaps the ewe lambs and the shearlings so that they can build their confidence in a nice, safe place. It's a similar story for our ewe lambs. Obviously, they've got quite a lot going on. Pre-lambing, we're looking to feed the same level of energy and protein as a mature ewe of the same body weight. So that's where you use your book values and you take into consideration that your ewe lamb might be 40, 50 kilos, and you look at what that requirement would be if that was a mature animal. And then after lambing, we're looking at 20% more energy and protein, and that's just to maintain their own growth because they've got quite a lot going on as well as milk production. And it might even be worth thinking about weaning that lamb maybe 10 weeks early, well, not 10 weeks earlier, a couple of weeks earlier, around 10 weeks, just to give that ewe lamb a bit more chance to recover, ready for that next pregnancy. And there's quite a bit of work to demonstrate benefits for only allowing her to rear one lamb in that first pregnancy while she's so young as well. So moving on to look at the different components of the diet. As we've seen, as our ewe approaches lambing, the nutrient requirement, that nutrient balance is going to be quite crucial. And energy is one of the most important nutrients. And we talk about it from an ME point of view, metabolizable energy. And this is the proportion of energy available to the animal. And we measure it in megajoules per day. And all feeds have an ME value, whether it be a compound or a forage or a block or a bucket, or, everything has got an energy value. And that metabolizable energy is provided by sugar, starch and fibre in the diet. And it's important to provide a selection of different types of energy. And it's a little bit like our own diet. If we just lived on quickly digested sugar all the time, we would have these massive peaks in energy. So if we just lived on Mars bars, which would be lovely, we'd have these massive peaks and troughs in terms of our instant energy hit. We need to take on those slower digested energies, for example, starches in sugars, in cereals, and then maybe, your digestible fibres, which are much more slow release, things like your sugar beet pulp, really nice for the room and much more slower release of energy. Like I say, we measure energy requirement in megajoules per ewe per day. So that requirement of ewes, and that will vary quite widely depending on the stage of production. And there's loads of really good book values in terms of just having a look at body weight and energy requirement. And then you can help look at your diet and how that's comparing to those requirements on the approach to lambing. In general, a ewe will require around 8 megajoules of energy per day for maintenance. However, when she's carrying twins and by lambing, her energy requirement will be up as high as 16 to 18 megajoules per day. So you can see that quite big jump. And we need to meet those energy requirements, otherwise we're going to put the animal at risk of things like twin lamb disease. And again, you know, it's worth understanding what you're supplying from a forage point of view so that you can top up appropriately and make sure you're hitting those energy values as well. We also talk a little bit about FME, which is fermentable metabolizable energy, and that's the energy that is used by the rumen bugs. And that's the energy used to make our microbial protein. So we'll talk a little bit about microbial protein in a minute, but it's a figure that it's worth just keeping in mind. Maybe when you sort of, if you want to dig into some of these numbers and look at what your diet is supplying and your requirements, you might need to look at that FME value. So looking at energy requirements, like we've said already, it varies according to production. And in that pre-lambing period, like we've already seen, it will increase quite rapidly. It will increase according to live weight, number of lambs, obviously. And obviously, as that lambing approaches, and she's got a lot more going on, the lamb's growing and the colostrum cells are forming. So like I say, our 70 kilo ewe carrying twins, she'll see a 60% increase in ME between 7 and 1 week pre-lambing. So like I've said, that's, you know, you're looking to go up to around 18, 19 megajoules per day as she gets a bit closer to lambing. Then when we move on into a post-lambing period, again, these are figures taken from AFRC 93, and a recent sort of review of these figures was felt that energy requirements as predicted by the AFRC were quite accurate. Protein was probably more of a minimum level, so we tend to sort of take the minimum level and build up from that, but energy was felt to be quite well represented. And actually, I think, you might be quite surprised here that our 70 kilo ewe carrying twins, producing 3 kilos of milk per day. So right at that peak lactation, her energy requirement is going to be about 33 megajoules per day. So quite a bit higher than actually what we saw in that late pregnancy. And this is the time where she may lose a little bit of condition. So 1 megajoule of energy per 50 grams of body weight loss. So she's got maybe a little bit of wiggle room to lose a bit of condition, to get a bit of energy that way. So if we think about a typical spring grass, for example, that has maybe 12 megajoules per kilo dry matter, and we think about our ewe, 70 kilo ewe taking about 3 to 3.5% body weight in terms of dry matter intake, she will eat maybe 2 to 2.5 kilos dry matter. So our 12 ME grass, you know, depending on how much of it she can eat, will depend on dry matter of it and all sorts, may not provide what we need. It can provide somewhere between 24 to 30 of those megajoules. And this is why we start to see these ewes starting to lose a bit of condition. But it's also why we should perhaps consider supplementing a little bit in that very short period, 3 to 4 weeks post lambing, to just help them get through that peak lactation. Just moving on now to look at the protein nutrition, and the protein of nutrition of our ruminant animals is a little bit more complicated. And over the last couple of years, we've understood even more the importance of the rumen bugs in this protein system and how we should be feeding on the approach to lambing. So just looking at the diagram we've got here on the left hand side, this is a kind of a mock-up of a rumen. And it demonstrates how our ruminant animals get their metabolizable protein. So like the metabolizable energy, this is the protein that is available for the animals to make use of. So this is the true protein absorbed by the intestine and available for the animal. So this is down here on the right hand side of our diagram, and it, broadly speaking, comes from 2 different sources. The first source of protein within that metabolizable protein is our microbial protein. So this is produced by the microbes in the rumen through the breakdown of either non-protein nitrogen, so this is things like urea that we might put in the diet, or rumen degradable protein. So this is protein that is degraded in the rumen by the rumen bugs. And along with a source of energy, and this is where our FME comes in, our fermentable metabolizable energy, this microbial protein is made and then will be washed out of the rumen alongside any microbes that might have died off, and it makes up between 60 and 75% of the metabolizable protein supply. So it makes up a very important amount of the true protein that our animals are needing. So to make sure that we get a good level of microbial protein, we need the rumen to be functioning well. We need a good balance of FME and NERDP, and we need that rumen to be functioning well. The remainder of that metabolizable protein, so that gap we have, will come from digestible undegradable protein, or DUP, we quite often call it. And this protein is almost protected by the rumen bugs, and we call it bypass protein. It's untouched by the rumen microbes, and then it just passes almost directly through the rumen, where it's broken down post-ruminally and digested as part of that metabolizable protein. So we know that metabolizable protein requirements have been increasing over the years, and actually we really need to come away from talking about crude protein in diets and talking more about animal requirements from a metabolizable protein point of view, and looking at how much metabolizable protein is being provided by a diet. We think that the increase in the requirements by animals is due to as breeding and pushing animals harder. But we also think that potentially those requirements are not going to be met by additional microbial protein alone. In what we mean is that the animals are already working to quite a high level to produce that microbial protein, and there's maybe not any more in the tank to top up that metabolizable protein, which puts greater emphasis on the DUP, or the digestible undegradable level of your diet, and therefore understanding when you're buying in feeds how that feed breaks down, rather than it just being a 14, 15, 16% crude protein diet. We should be looking at how much of that is digestible undegradable protein to help top up what those animals need. And again, not all proteins are equal. When we look at feeds, we look at things like soya and rape. We need to be feeding as good a quality protein as possible on the approach to lambing, and trying to get that good level of digestible undegradable protein. So moving on to look at some of our protein requirements, as we did with the energy. Like I said, we use
Alison,
AFRC.
Interrupt you just for 1 second,
yes,
because you've been talking quite a lot, and I imagine you're wondering if anyone's still there. Sometimes it's quite challenging behind the screen like that.
I'm used to talking to myself. I have 2 children. It's fine.
I have 2 questions have come in. One is from Andrew and one is from James.
Yeah.
The first one, it relates back to your feeding we were talking about earlier, and it's if your ewe is your ewe spelled Y-O-U. If your ewe is in poor condition at 6 weeks pre-lambing, how effective is a lot of feed later on at late lactate or late gestation? Is that going to be a good thing to do?
It's not ideal, if I'm honest. It's going to put her under quite a lot of stress. You really need to be looking at body condition score a bit further out. I mean, ideally, you want, I mean, it's too late now, but you wanted her to be in the best body condition score possible at tupping time. And actually, there's some new work done through Neris Wright, has done a PhD on looking at body condition score reviews, and she's involved in the Challenge Sheep project by AHDB. And what they've found is that ewes respond quite well to almost an increasing plane of nutrition throughout pregnancy and mid-pregnancy, whereas historically we would have let animals lose a bit of condition. If they're not in particularly good condition, you just need to feed them well. I don't think you'll make up lost ground as such, but you just need to make sure that diet is as best quality as you possibly can.
Will that help colostrum quality and sort of milk production, or will it sort of, I suppose it's not going to put condition on the ewe, but it's going to perhaps just give a bit more lamb size and just milk quality, and then it's going to take a lot more care of the ewe afterwards when they're in that poor condition. You're going to have to probably feed it longer later. Depending on the season you end up having in terms of weather and grass growth, it might be that you consider early weaning, just to allow her to really get back on track before you put her to the tup again. And I know that seems like such a long way away, but there is a lot more information around that sort of bigger picture now. So that ties in with the second question I had, which was from James. If you didn't feed your ewe lambs enough post lambing, will it impact on their lifetime performance? So will you see decreased lamb numbers from them later?
Yeah, Yeah, there is, again, you know, this Challenge Sheep project. It was a 7-year project. It's just coming to an end now. And that was what they were trying to look at. They were trying to look at all these kind of things that might influence production longer term. And yeah, if you don't support that ewe in terms of growth, then she will go on to have, you know, poorer reproductive performance going forward on into the future. So
Right, okay.
it's if that ewe lamb is not at a good level, and again, it's too late now, but it's worth holding on to them for another year and taking them through to a shearling rather than breeding them if they're not able to they're not growing at a good rate, I suppose, or at a good size.
So essentially, just keep, if you can, keep them in a ewe lamb group as long as you can, and just make sure the first, but in tip-top nutrition for them is a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I shall stop with the questions now and let you carry on,
Perfect.
and then we'll come back some more in a minute. So just so you know, we were still here.
Well, you are anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Moving on, like I said, to look at those protein requirements. So we use AFRC from 1993, and like I say, recently they undertook a review, and they felt that actually those levels that are reported in that report should be viewed as a kind of a minimum requirement for our ewes on the approach to lambing and beyond into lactation. So in terms of sort of managing those requirements, we talk about metabolizable protein, as we've just mentioned, and we've just mentioned that it's made up by that microbial protein plus that DUP. So what we need to calculate, and again, you know, this is easily sort of done on sort of longhand, is the amount of microbial protein that our animals can produce based on the diet that we are giving them. So we talk about related to the level of FME. So you'll see things like FME, ERDP, those kind of values on your silage sheets when you have your silage analysed. And that's why we need it, because we need to understand that level of fermentable metabolizable energy. And then we take our supply of metabolizable energy, is microbial protein, and we times it by this factor, which is an estimation of true protein content of the microbial protein, and then the digestibility of that true protein, and that gives us this sort of factor of 0.63. So we times our microbial protein by the 0.63, and then we add our DUP to it, and that will give us our animal requirement. So as I've said, those requirements will increase from about 60% from 7 weeks to 1 week pre-lambing. So our 70 kilo ewe on the approach to lambing we'll see an increase from about 93 grams per day of metabolizable protein up to about 126 grams per day. And we see a similar increase again when we get into that post-lambing period. So again, that ewe with twins producing 3 kilos per day at peak lactation will have a requirement of about 303 grams per day of metabolizable protein. So like I say, you can then work out how much your diet's providing from to support that microbial production, and you can work out your gap then in terms of what your diet needs to provide from a DUP point of view. So moving on to look at sort of key minerals, vitamins and trace elements, and I'm not going to spend a long time talking about these, and I'm not going to talk about them all either. We've got about 100 minerals in life, about 40 of those have a metabolic role in the body, but some are required in such small amounts that we don't really talk about them. So we have 15 elements in particular that we talk about, and we know that they are essential for good health in cattle and sheep. And what I want to do over the next couple of slides is just literally touch on a couple that are important as we approach lambing time and on into lactation. So the first two major elements are calcium and magnesium. And that calcium plays a very important role in body and bone structure, but it also plays a very important role in terms of having a good balance on the approach to lambing to prevent things like milk fever. So we know that in late pregnancy and early lactation, animals are going through this sort of quite reasonably stressful time when they lamb down and then they start milking. It's quite a pull on the calcium reserves that can't be released from the stores fast enough. And we see this risk of milk fever if we don't quite get that calcium balance right. And there's some suggestion that also a milk fever, a sort of a marginal milk fever, can be linked to prolapse as well. So again, it's worth looking at those calcium and mag levels. On the other side, we're looking at sort of magnesium and low magnesium, in particular in early lactation, when that quite a lot of mag is being put into the milk, but also spring grass itself is quite low in mag. We can put that animal at risk of grass staggers. So again, we need to be looking at that post-lambing diet from a magnesium point of view, and just making sure that we've perhaps got a supplement out there to support that. Just moving on to look at vitamin E and selenium. Vitamin E is an essential antioxidant. It helps the animal fight off disease, protects cells from damage during normal production. So normal production, animals will be producing these free radicals, and antioxidants will help sort of get rid of those and stop causing any problems. So that vitamin E plays a very important role. Vitamin E itself will not pass easily across the placenta to the lamb during pregnancy. So lambs will therefore rely on vitamin E from the used colostrum and milk after birth. So it's important that mum is fed a good level of vitamin E to make sure that that colostrum and vitamin E, colostrum and milk have good levels of vitamin E. And there's lots of nice trials showing the benefits of higher levels of vitamin E on the approach to lambing, in terms of that link with selenium, and also that link to lamb vigor, and animals getting up and suckling and getting on with it, which is really important. Vitamin E, because of its link also with the immune system, is also linked to things like mastitis and the prevention of that, involved in that kind of white blood cell production, which is really important for fighting any kind of bacteria that gets into perhaps the udder. Selenium is very similar to our vitamin E in terms of the fact that it acts as a natural antioxidant, and it will work alongside our vitamin E. But unlike vitamin E, selenium will pass across the placenta. So it's important that our ewe is fed good levels of selenium on the approach to lambing, to make sure that it is passed across to our unborn lamb, because selenium plays a really important role in the brown fat. So all baby lambs, all baby animals are born with this like mini little hot water bottle that I always think of it as being a little bit like those pocket warmers with the little metal clips that you press to heat up. And when the baby is born, that metal clip just triggers, and that brown fat gives them that little bit of energy. It burns very, very quickly, and it's gone very quickly, but it's so important for them to get up and get going and start shivering and feeding and moving and get going. And once they've got that belly full of colostrum, then they get going even more. But that process by which that brown fat switched on is a selenium dependent process. So if our ewe is selenium deficient, our lamb will be selenium deficient, and that process of triggering that brown fat when they're born won't occur, which puts animals at higher risk of things like hypothermia, and they don't get up and they don't suckle quickly, they don't get that colostrum that they need. So selenium, very important on the approach to lambing time. And then just two more trace elements that we sometimes come across. Zinc occurs quite widely throughout the body, greatest concentration in things like skin, wool, hair, horn, so foot health, udder health. It's involved in many different processes within the body, and therefore involved in a lot of different functions. In particular, it's involved in the metabolism of proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, which makes it very important for that skin, that bone, that wool, that foot health, all those tissue health. And because of its importance in tissue health, it plays quite an important role in things like wound healing, but also internal tissues as well. So cardiac tissue, lung tissue, gut tissue, and also that involvement in the immune system function as well, and cell membrane structure, and working in the gut to prevent sort of bacteria and stuff getting into the system. We know levels in the UK forages are often quite low. So again, it's worth looking at some kind of zinc supplementation as we get a bit closer to lambing, when that animal is under quite a lot of stress, and putting them at risk of different issues. And then finally, we've got cobalt. Cobalt plays a very important role in B12. So it's required. the animal itself doesn't have a massive cobalt requirement. It's the bugs, the rumen bugs again, that have that requirement for cobalt, and they turn that cobalt into B12. And B12 plays a very important role in energy utilization. But we know that foragers are often deficient in cobalt, so any kind of deficiency could impact on our lamb's growth and going forward our 8-week weights and things like that. But then also it plays a role in fertility as well. So again, thinking about that ewe as she goes through that lactation and on then to the next pregnancy, we don't want to see any deficiencies in these trace elements that we have to then top up with later in the season. And then just before we move on to our grazing and our forages, I wanted to just drop a slide in. I couldn't quite decide where to put this slide. I've moved it around a few times, just to mention water really and the importance of water. And water requirements will vary according to stage of production, and in particular, they will vary according to the water content of the diet. But in late pregnancy, we should really be allowing about 4.5 litres per ewe per day for a ewe that's on a drier diet. If they're being fed moist silage or a root diet, then that requirement may drop to around 2 litres. But post lambing, when they're in peak lactation, that ewe can take about up to 10 litres per ewe per day. And again, quite often they'll be out at grass by this point, and grass has obviously got quite a low dry matter. So actually, they probably won't drink 10 litres exactly, but it's important that that water supply is there when you're setting up your shed, when you're thinking about that lambing, and making sure that there is that access to that water. And it goes without saying, it needs to be clean. You need to look at it and think you'd want to drink it, and it needs to be available at all times as well. So any questions before we move on to grazing and forages, John? Anything come in?
So yeah, we had two more comments. One was on the group chat. So just as a quick reminder to everyone, you can type a question. If you go to the top of the screen, you should say Q&A. That will take you to a side screen, which you can type in a question anytime you want, which we can read out, or I can let Alison know it's there and we'll try and answer it. But the one user said, going back to our comments about not enough nutrition early in gestation and then feeding quite a lot, won't feeding hard in the last 6 weeks grow large lambs and create lambing issues, which I assume, yes, it will to some extent, but are you caught between a rock and a hard place at that point?
Well, you are, and that's the difficulty, isn't it? You've got a ewe that's under conditioned and potentially carrying twins, and you want those twins to get off to a good start. So it is a very fine balancing act, to be honest, because you're quite right. If you push them too hard, especially if they're carrying singles, because perhaps they're only carrying a single because earlier on in the pregnancy or around tupping time they weren't in as good a condition as they should have been, you might end up with a larger lamb. So it is, it's a balance. It is a balance.
And then one from again from Andrew, but this is from R.M.Jones Andrew, which is, there's no liquid calcium available at the moment, no Calciject. Are the oral products any good? Are they going to cut the mustard when it comes to calcium deficiency?
Oh, good question. I think my
Don't
first
tell him
answer
that, because you'll get all excited and you'll brag about it for ages.
I don't know, if I'm honest. I don't know enough about them, but it's really about the balance. And I suppose if you've got a good balance, and to a certain degree, we're going to talk about forages in a minute, but what you're feeding and what your animal needs, then you can work out how best to fill that gap. And obviously liquid calcium plays a part. It's going to play a part, but if your diet is balanced well on the build up to lambing, then potentially you shouldn't need it.
Okay, no, that's grand. I'll let you carry on with grass and forages while I go and beat up some children and turn their music down and just annoy me. Okay.
Brilliant.
Cheers, Alison.
Right. So forages is going to be our base of our diet on the approach to lambing, and silage, hay, it's the main ingredient, and it will, it's the cheapest feed on farm as well. So we need to be basing our diet around this key ingredient. But the key really is that we we need to know what it is as well. And if we were sat in a room now, and I did try and see if I could put a poll on this, but I couldn't, so I couldn't get my head around it. But if we were in a room now, I'd be asking for a show of hands as to how many of you had your forages analysed, because it is, you know, you can't balance your forage if you don't know what you've got. It's no good just having a smell and saying, well, it looks all right, they're eating it. We need to know, what's in there. So definitely get your forage analysed, at the very least a nutritional analysis, so that you know what energy and protein you've got in front of you. But ideally have a look at the minerals and vitamins as well. This here is a table demonstrating what AHDB deem to be the ideal silage for sheep. Sheep like relatively dry, well-made silage. This will help ensure optimum intake. And we'll look again in a minute at sort of how to drive that intake. So remember that table or that graph we saw at the beginning with the green gap. We really want to try and drive dry matter intake. The better the quality, the more the ewe can eat. So in late lactation, she'll eat between 2 and 2.5% of her body weight in dry matter. So this is about 1.5 to 1.75 kilo dry matter for a 70 kilo ewe. About 60 to 80% of that should be from forage. So this is equating to a good kilo of forage in the diet every day. And the better quality, the more she's going to get from that kilo. So as we've already mentioned, as our ewe approaches lambing, we want to offer that best forage we can due to her requirements increasing with her decreased rumen capacity. So this table just demonstrates how much forage a ewe can eat on the approach to lambing as a percentage of body weight. And what we can see is we've got our different forages down the left-hand side here. We can see our different MEs, so we can see that actually from top to bottom our forages are improving. And what we can see here is that actually as they improve, our animal can eat more as a percentage of her body weight from forage. So our key message really is that if you're having forages analysed and you've got a better forage, save it for closer up to lambing, because that is, you know, one way of shrinking that energy gap that we've demonstrated right at the beginning. And let's think about how we present that forage as well. We really want to try and maximise intakes. And so this was work undertaken in Ireland a few years ago, and it shows that the presentation of the silage will actually affect the amount of cake needed to top up. So you can see that our precision chop silage resulted in a much lower cake requirement in that last 6 weeks of pregnancy. And you can see that this was largely basically due to easier eating. So forage was eaten better and more efficiently, and forage intakes were increased. And it's the same with us and how food's presented to us. You know, if somebody just put a whole lettuce in front of you, you'd struggle to chomp your way through it. But if we can chop it up into a nice salad, you'd probably plough through a fair bit. And it's a similar story. You can see here that with the silage that was baled, we can see sort of more forage was needed, more compound was needed to top up. And this was looking at the digestibility of the forages as well. And we can see again that digestibility of the forage affected also that amount of compound needed to be fed. So obviously chopping bales is not always going to be possible, but if feeding bales, it's always worth looking and making sure that there's adequate space, adequate trough space. We're looking at sort of 45 to 50 centimetres for ewes at troughs with concentrate. That space required decreases down to about 15 centimetres when you're looking at ad lib silage and forages being fed. We've talked already about those younger animals, those shyer animals potentially being grouped and separated, and that also goes for, we've not talked about separating at scanning, maybe ewes are carrying triplets or thinner ewes, or just splitting animals up into groups so you can manage them better. And it's also always worth just having a look at monitoring intakes if you can, getting a bit of an idea of how much a bale is in terms of weight, and are they eating what you expect them to be. You've got a group of 100 ewes, you're feeding them one bale, what's that working out as per animal per day, and just sort of having a look and monitoring that nutritional quality against what they're eating, and just making sure that they are getting what you think they should be getting. And again, Don't forget the water. That's absolutely crucial, because water drives dry matter intake as well. Again, you know yourself, if someone gives you a packet of cream crackers to eat, you're going to struggle to plough through them. But if you've got some water there, you can increase that dry matter intake. So just before we move on, I've mentioned a couple of times, it is really always worth having your forage analysed. It's not particularly good practice to just feed, or we always feed a kilo of cake, so we just feed a kilo of cake, because sometimes you might not need it, sometimes you might need a bit more, and that's just what I want to demonstrate on this slide before we kind of move on from forages. So we've got our 70 kilo ewe carrying twins, 3 weeks pre-lambing, and some of these figures are just in there for ease, but give you some kind of demonstration. So she needs about 15.3 megajoules of energy per day. If she eats, she's going to eat, assuming 1 kilo dry matter of forage, just for simplicity. If our grass silage is a 9.7 ME, she's got a gap of 5.6 megajoules. So that gap we need to fill with compound, for example. So she'll need about 450 grams of compound per day, a 12.5 ME compound, to fill that gap of 5.6 megajoules. If, however, that grass silage is a little bit better quality than we perhaps realise, and it's 11.1 ME, then that gap is much smaller. She still has the same requirement, but she doesn't need so much compound to get up to the level that she's requiring. So she only needs then 350 grams of compound per day. So, you know, that's 100 grams of compound each day less per ewe, just because you've had your forage analysed and just because you know how much energy she's actually getting from that base diet. So, you know, if we're looking at 100 ewes in a group, you're saving maybe nearly 1/4 ton of compound feed. And the cost of having a nutritional analysis done on your feed is maybe £12–15. I think it's really good money spent, to be honest, just to understand what's going on. Just looking at what we've seen this year in particular from a grass growth and a forage point of view, this is a Grass Check GB graph taken off their website, demonstrating that grass growth through the year. It's a reasonably typical curve that we see, that peak grass growth around May, June. The orange line is the beef and sheep. The blue line is beef and sheep, sorry, 2023. The blue line is 2022, and the orangey line is the 4-year average. It was quite an interesting year this year because, well, last year, sorry, now we had quite a strong peak in grass growth because we had some really good weather in kind of end of May, June, and I think we all kind of went, oh, we're going to go into another drought situation, and then that grass dropped away very quickly. The weather improved. But then we also saw sort of, I think the rain came, and I'm pretty sure the rain came on the first day of the school holidays and then didn't stop until September when they went back to school. And what that meant is that come the end of August, we almost had another peak in grass growth. And then that meant we went into tupping with a good level of grass. Everything was very, very green, and green quite late into the season. So you can see that actually what that's given us is above average grass growth almost throughout the season, and grass available late into the season, maybe reducing that requirement for supplementation at tupping. However, the quality was a little bit dubious, and that's perhaps what's caught people out a little bit this year. So another graph, I'm afraid, but this is demonstrating the difference in quality between 2023, so last year, and an average of the 3 years before that, 2020 to 2022. So if our grass last year had been exactly the same as the average, we'd expect all these lines to be along this dotted line. So our blue line is our energy. So what we can see here is that consistently throughout that grazing season last year, energy was slightly below average. Not much, but it just sat there below average. Our purple line is our dry matter, and again we saw it increase as we went on through the season, and then drop away. And then our protein is our yellow line, and again that pretty much sort of followed where we would expect it to be, but on average slightly below. The one that is very interesting is actually this green line, and that's why I've left it for last, because this green line is sugars, and throughout the season we can see that sugar level was consistently lower, sometimes between up to 50% lower than the previous 3-year average. And if you can remember back to that conversation we've had about fermentable metabolizable energy, so that energy available for our bugs to produce microbial protein, this is the energy they need. This sugar is providing really good levels of fermentable metabolizable energy, but we don't have it, or we didn't have it last year in the grazing. And this is, gone on to be demonstrated in our forage samples as well, our preserved forages. So there may be a little bit of restriction in microbial protein, and therefore we might need to be topping up our DUP as we get a bit closer to lambing to make sure that we are providing enough protein for milk production and colostrum production. So, like I say, that sort of growing season went on to be represented in our silage quality. So this is a bit of a sum up of our 2023 versus 2022. And we can see the overall silage was well fermented, but that quality was very variable. If we go on to remember last winter, it was quite a warm winter. Grass never really died off. So we saw more mature grass, and this is reflected in the slightly higher lignin level we've seen. That lignin is that kind of indigestible fibre. And we've seen ME and protein both sort of on average below what we've seen in previous years. And again, that sugar quite a bit lower than previous years, and just again reflecting what we've seen in that grazing season as well. So potentially lower feed value and potentially lower intake potential on those silages this year. So again, I say it every year, but it is just well worth having your forage analysed and just getting a picture of what's going on. So like I said, what this means for us is that plenty of grazing available on the approach to tupping, but that quality, low sugar, lower ME may have affected pregnancy establishment, and you'll know how your farm's looking, and it's probably looking better than it was maybe last year where we had that drought. And again, we saw a lot of a higher number of singles versus twins because of the sort of the lower amounts of forage available around tupping time. But it's going to be really important to look at those diets, look at what you've got in front of you, and supplement accordingly, and supporting that body condition score to help that milk and colostrum to keep that lamb moving well to hit that good 8-week target. So really try and understand that forage quality. Poor nutrition, what happens? And again, we've talked about a lot of this. We see reduced body condition score. We saw poor ewe immunity. We see this periparturient rise in fecal egg count. So the animal goes through a stress period, and if their body is not if they've not got good enough nutrition to be supporting their immune system, then we may see this rise in fecal egg counts, and that can impact our lambs when they go onto that field as well. We see poorer quality colostrum, we see poor wool growth, lamb birth weights are low, vigor's low, retained placentas, all sorts of issues if we don't get that nutrition quite right on the approach to lambing. So just a couple more slides, just looking at how we can perhaps balance that diet. We've talked a lot about forages, and once you've got your forage analysis back and you know what you've got, the next challenge is looking at what your animals need and how do you get to that level as to what they need. And obviously a couple of different options. One of the primary options would be we'd be topping up with compound feeds, and quite often this is what's fed. Compound will substitute forage. So in other words, the more compound is fed, the less forage that will be eaten. So we need to balance compound feeding from that point of view, because we want to get the most out of the forage we've got on farm. There's a lot of choice available when it comes to compound feeds. It is a little bit of a minefield. It's a useful tool for helping to prevent twin lamb disease. Do ask for the energy value. Quite often it is not declared. It doesn't have to be declared on the label, but if you're buying it, you have a right to know. So do ask for the ME value. You want your ME to be between 12 and 12.5. You want to know that you've got good quality ingredients in there. So you should be, your supplier should be happy to supply you with a full formulation, including those ingredients. It's important to look at the protein level. Crude protein alone is not really enough, as hopefully I've demonstrated. So, feel free to ask for your DUP values, your RDP values. Ask where that protein's coming from. Is it soya? Is it rape? Is it distillers? Is it poorer quality proteins in there? Look at your mineral and vitamin profile. Consider topping up if required. You should be feeding a consistent formulation. excuse me. You don't want any changes as you approach lambing, because that can be a little bit stressful. So don't want it to be a least cost formulation, and sort of stay away from formulations with lots of things like oat feed in them. So do look at the label, look at the list of ingredients. They'll be listed in descending order in terms of inclusion, and you want to look at sort of some sort of rules of oil between 4 and 5%. So you want to know that they're not putting oil in to get your ME up. And you want ash below 10, fibre below 10. It's worth thinking of possibly about supplementary feeds. So when we're talking about supplementary feeds, we're talking about blocks, buckets, liquids, proteins, minerals, and these can be really useful to sort of correct those nutritional deficiencies and just give that little boost on the approach to lambing. They're quite useful for feeding in situations where there may be a little bit of bullying, because they offer something to be there 24/7. And it's a very different mode of action to feeding from compound feeds, because they are supplements, so they will not impact the amount of forage being eaten. In fact, they may drive the forage being eaten rather than substituting. The Optilix High Energy that R.M.Jones can help you out with is a really nice high energy bucket, nice level of protein in there, all natural protein. And this is it's a low moisture type bucket, so it's got a really high sugar level in there. So works really well against these perhaps lower sugar forages that we're seeing this year. And a full spec of your minerals, vitamins and trace elements. So a really nice top up bucket for going alongside your forages on the approach to lambing. So that energy, those sugar, that's going to support that ewe body condition. It's going to help balance that grass and forage, make sure that those animals get the most from it. And then it's got a little balance of a little bit of urea protein in there, as well as that natural protein to support milk production. And like I say, all the mins and bits, including protected selenium, protected zinc. So these are more bioavailable sources of selenium and zinc, which again will support that animal health and performance on the approach to lambing time. And then good levels of vitamin E in there as well. Alternatively, you might want to think about home mixing. This year in particular, cereal harvest was a little bit variable, so we've perhaps got a bit of cereal sat around on farm that wasn't perhaps up to quality that we needed to be. I've got a 5-minute warning come up. So ideal perhaps if you've got some on farm, provide quite high energy and starch, but a little bit mixed protein level depending on the cereal you've got available, and deficient in calcium, so need to look at that sort of mineral balance as well. And consider sort of how you feed them to prevent sort of digestive upset, acidosis, that kind of thing. But feeding to sheep, they don't necessarily need to be processed. Sheep are quite good at cracking grains themselves, and look at maybe different proteins to balance those cereals, and a good mineral pack as well. So advantage of home mixing is using those homegrown feeds. You've got control of those ingredients, control of that diet. You can change your protein levels and your overall look of the diet as and well when you want to suit your system. So it enables that flexibility, and quite often works out lower cost than bought in equivalent. So R.M.Jones have a number of proteins available in their range that they could help you out with, and obviously I'm more than happy to look at some rations and looking at that for you if required. One interesting one is the Supreme Sheep 40. It's a 40% protein. It's all natural proteins. It's got an extra little bit of energy in there as well as the combi sheep and cattle, which is a slightly higher protein, but it's got a little bit of urea and natural protein. So again, depending on your system, depending on what you're trying to do, we can look at diets containing those two. So an example mix, for example, with that Supreme 40, very simple 90%, 10% ratio would give you a protein of about 15.5% in the total mix. It would give you an energy of about 13.5. It would provide your minerals, all your minerals you'd need. So that's 4 bags per tonne, and that natural protein is going to support milk and colostrum. And on farm, approximately you're looking at about £238 per tonne. So really nice, cost-effective way of feeding ewes this season. So just to sum up. hopefully I've demonstrated that pre-lambing period all the way through to immediately post-lambing as well. Really key time in the sheep calendar. The dry matter intake is reducing quite drastically on the approach to lambing, but at a time when her energy and protein and nutrient demands are increasing quite considerably. And then this goes on into that lactation as well. Understand your forage you've got available in front of you, that's your base, and then build up from there in terms of looking at energy protein requirements. If we don't get that nutrition right, we put our animals at risk of things like twin lamb disease, reduced immunity, colostrum production, which is going to then impact our lamb and impact our ewe potentially into her next season as well. Consider sort of all sorts of things to help balance that forage, compound, maybe even home mixing if you've got some cereal available, or supplementary feeding to support that forage as well. I'm going to pass over to John now because I think he's going to really quickly just go through a bit of a lambing list, but I'm not going anywhere, so we can have any questions in a minute.
Okay, so I think what we'll do, Alison, we'll just quickly cover some questions that have come through for yourself, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So there's 4 on here so far. One of which is, when would you introduce Optilix?
I would look about 4 to 6 weeks pre-lambing. That seems to be a reasonably optimum time. That tends to be the time when you start to prepare that animal for lambing, and certainly that's, we know that's the time when she's starting to prepare sort of colostrum production and that kind of stuff as well.
There's quite a bit of data to suggest that sort of those high energy blocks, they'll stimulate greater forage intake as well.
Yeah, and not just intake, but utilization as well, which means that for every mouthful that they're taking, they're going to get more out of it. So it's going to give them more. And like we say, that's the cheapest feed on the farm. That needs to be the base. You need to know what's there, and then you can top up from there. So yeah, really, really nice data behind feeding, all these kind of free access supplements on the approach to lambing.
And then I've had a message on my phone saying, can I feed straw as my silage is awful? I think that's probably, there's been a lot of not great silage produced this year. It's just been produced either a bit, it's a bit tough because it's been cut late and it's a bit high fiber. But yeah, straw, I suppose the question would be, is how are we going to improve straw quality enough to make it acceptable to put in front of
molasses, maybe a bit of molasses, the old watering can of molasses over the top, just to improve that palatability of it and drive that intake. I think the issue is, if you're going to feed straw, your base diet is going to be starting quite low. So in terms of energy and protein, you've got to think about where your energy and protein is going to come from. You don't want a lot of cake to be fed. That's going to put animals at sort of a risk of maybe an acidosis. You're limited as to how much you should be feeding, 2 meals a day or that kind of stuff. So yeah, you just need to perhaps look at some alternatives. How poor is your silage? Because is it as poor as straw? Could you mix the two together if the silage isn't particularly palatable? Or yeah, like I say, think about something like a molasses to go on it.
I suppose if you're on roots or something like that, whereas if you were to put straw in a ring feeder, at least they've got the quality of the roots, but at the same time they have a bit of fiber. You can eke out the forage a little bit.
Yeah.
Along those lines wouldn't probably do quite a good job.
Yeah.
And following on from that, another message is, I only have hay and it's not the best. What can I do to increase intake and quality of that forage? Well, you're not going to increase the quality, I guess, now, but
no.
Again, I suppose molasses sounds like an answer there.
Molasses, but again, if people don't, handling molasses can be an issue. But again, something like the Optilix, high sugar, low moisture bucket alongside, it will drive the intake of that poorer, drier forage. It should work quite well with it.
And then up on the chat, we've had a question about roots. So I would think something like fodder beet or Swedes. Can we analyze roots, or do we just accept a book average value?
they can't be analysed through NIR, which is what we analyse our silages through. There's no calibrations available for roots through that, so we would recommend a wet chem, which costs more. So it's often easier just to use a kind of a book value to get a bit of an idea of what's going on. And I suppose the biggest issue with them is knowing how much they're eating as well, and understanding that dry matter intake off that field.
There's just a reminder to everyone, at the top of your screen it has Q&A written up there. If you click on that, it should bring up a screen on a sub screen on the right hand side where you can type in any questions you want. So we've had another one come in from Lee. Is there a higher risk of listeria in silage made this autumn? Should we be testing?
Oh, good question. In terms of because of soil contamination, or is that what you're thinking?
I don't know. It's just that's the question was just that. Is there a higher risk of listeria? I'd imagine listeria is driven more by contamination.
Yes.
In the silage rather than the actual quality of the grass. Yes.
So I'm just thinking, I suppose it depends if you harvested or you took your silage when it was particularly wet and you had quite a lot of soil spores in there, then that can put you at higher risk. I haven't heard that there is a higher risk, but I don't know whether it's worth speaking. It's probably more of a vet issue when it gets to listeria. Maybe speaking to them about whether they know if there's a higher risk or they've seen more, perhaps. I don't know how easy it is to get it tested either.
The crucial thing, I guess, is if you have a bale of silage or if you have any silage in there, that if there's any mouldy elements in there, they've got to be out of the feed. You can't leave those in. They've got to go out, especially for late lactation use.
Yeah, especially for those animals.
Yeah, I know with myself, I just chuck it in. There's a bit of bedding in the corner, and whatever happens to it happens to it. But it's it's not very good use of it. But it's at least they don't eat it, which is quite.
Yeah.
Any more questions from anyone? I'm sure there's at least one or two more in there. So in the meantime, like I said, at the top of the screen, you've got Q&A. Just click on that, and then you can ask a question in the box, type a question in the box. Or if you have my phone number, text or WhatsApp me a message across, as I've got a few of those sent to me this evening. So thank you, Alison. I really appreciate that. We might come back to the question in a minute, but in the meantime, we're going to move on slightly to just the very basics around lambing yards. So I think I've got to present this one briefly because we had someone lined up to do it, but they couldn't make it. So you have to bear with me. I'm not very good at doing this. I think I got to do this, which is share that. I assume everyone can see that. Alison, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
You can see that, or at least someone can see it then. So, so I was sent this, and I think it was plagiarized off someone else, which is quite good for me. So really what we're going to do briefly over the next 2 or 3 minutes is just cover the basics of a lambing yard and the crucial things to make it all go smoothly and successfully. So let's go back a screen. So that looks a fabulous lambing yard. It looks light, it's airy, there's plenty of straw in there. You've got a little point where you can operate from. It's got lots of pens. So we're not all as fortunate as that. Some of us have to deal with the lambing yards we are given, but there's lots of things we can do to make them work as effectively as possible. So what are the essentials? So there's 3 things really: dry and warm, calm and orderly, and hygiene. I'm not going to read everything out that's written on there. I was told always work on the basis of 3 things. That's what people remember. But basically, dry and warm, plenty of bedding, not too windy. Make sure it's no damp spots. And then calm and orderly. That's just as it sounds. You don't want to hear lots of banging and crashing, lots of noises. You want to be able to have a bit of a routine, a plan, know where stuff is when you need it, and make sure that when you're feeding, going back to what Alison commented on earlier, there's 45 to 50 centimeters per ewe of feed space, that the feeding process is calm. Everything's not bustling up to the lambing fence, because that's when you start getting the feed fence, because that's when you start getting lots of problems. Can you feed on the bedding, for instance? Can you use Optilix blocks out in the pen? At least they have access to those 24/7. Can you use 3-in-1 feeders if you have access to those? They're quite good. And then hygiene. Hygiene is crucial. So one of the comments that was made was anything that goes inside a sheep should be disinfected. And that's very, very true. So anything that you use to help assist with the lambing, to any gloves that you use, any ropes, etc., they have to be kept clean and disinfected. So hygiene is crucial. Just keep everything clean, tidy. That includes the feed. So if feed has been at the feed fence, silage has been at the feed fence for a couple of days, starting to go down off a bit, you're not going to maintain the intakes you need to get. So clean it out, feed it to something else that will take it. You have some store cattle at the back, put it in front of those. That'll be fine. And then obviously with lambing pens, make sure there's plenty of them. 1 to 10 is great. If you can't reach 1 to 10, get as close to that as you can. More is brilliant, because you always end up with a situation where you think you're going to have you've got 10, you clean out 10 lambing pens and everything's ready to go again. All of a sudden you have 15 ewes lamb in a rush and you think, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Where am I going to put them? And you start finding corners. So keep as many lambing pens as you can. Then the next one, lamb care. Basics are treat everything, treat every lamb's navel. Hygiene, 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 as we said earlier on. And then do it twice. If you can do it straight away when you pen up, and then within 3 to 4 hours, do it a second time. It pays dividends. Things like joint hills go disappearing off down out in the distance. You don't see them as much. And keep your lambing pens clean. Now, I don't disinfect my lambing pens. I don't clean my lambing pens out, but I make sure there's plenty of clean straw in there all the time. Now, you're supposed to keep them cleaned out, you're supposed to disinfect them. But if you're doing a good job of keeping them clean and dry, that's the crucial thing. And obviously pull out any afterbirths. Then when it comes to lambs, making sure there's plenty of colostrum. So those 3 C's, quality, quantity, and quickly. I'll let you read the data on there, but get it in there really quickly and get enough in there as quickly as you can. And if you can't get the used colostrum, use ours, because it's the best on the market without a doubt, down on Lamb Force colostrum. And then shelter. If it's wet and windy outside, don't go putting your lambs out. We've all been there and been forced into doing things like that. Ideally, have an area where you can put ewes and lambs, hold them for 24, 36 hours until the weather breaks, or just as long as they've hardened off a little bit. But when you are going to put them out, then they need to go into those shelter paddocks, stick that, make sure there's bales out there, or make sure there's hedges out there that they can run up against, things like that. And don't be scared to bring them back in. Again, we've all been there where we're running full on space. Sometimes just bringing them for 24 hours just helps create a bit more, or stops them picking up dead ones in the following morning, which is never nice. And then the last bit, which is the checklist. Make a checklist. This isn't going to cover everything, but make a checklist. You can have a look through that, write things down. We can send you a checklist. They're on the counters in all the farm centres as well. Things you need, just make sure you got them there, and make sure all those things are kept ideally in a lambing yard in one place, so everyone knows where they are and when to get them. And if they run short, you can jot it on a notice board or in the diary or whatever you use in your lambing area, just so everyone knows when we need more of it, or what we need, or when we've run out. That's basically covering lambing yards, and it's really quick. So I'm going to stop sharing now and move back to my screen somewhere. Okay. I think we're back, aren't we? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any more questions? Anything at all from anyone? Alison, there's no more questions.
No more questions.
You can go for a cup of tea now.
Oh,
or something for your throat.
Oh, maybe a wine, maybe.
Oh, okay, fair enough. You old alky, you. Right, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'd like to say thank you to Alison for another great talk, and hopefully we'll have something else to follow up later in the next couple of weeks or a couple of months in relation to cattle nutrition. Oh, what's this? Oh yeah, there's just a note came up on the screen. We'll have something relating to cattle nutrition before turnout and at grazing. So that will be later in February, March time, but we'll keep you up to date on those. We will have more talks through the course of the winter on various topics. If you have any topics you think you might want to hear about, please send them into the farm centres, message us, put them on the website, all sorts of things. Just get hold of us and let us know what sort of talks you'd like, and we'll see what we can set up. And in the meantime,
just going to add one more thing. Sorry, John, but I'm just going to say that this is an absolute Bible. Feeding the You, AHDB's book, produced a number of years ago now. Kate Phillips, Leslie Stubbings were involved in it. It takes you through the lambing sort of season in nice sections. Some of those equations, I know some of the microbial protein stuff's a bit, so that's all in there. That's, you know, so and that's downloadable off the AHDB website. If you just go on and then just look for literature, it's downloadable off there. So sorry to interrupt you, but just wanted to say that that's a really, really useful resource.
Not a problem at all, because they are good. I've read some of those and they are very, very good. We might be able to put links. I don't know if we can. Might be able to put links on the website that if we need to, people can click on those, and from those links take you into those. That might work quite well. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening in the dark and the cold, especially in my house. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone.